Hello everyone, my name is John Smith. It's Tuesday evening, it's February the 1st in 2022, and it's time for our online Bible study that is being offered by the Church of Christ in Weyburn, the congregation for which I serve as a minister. And we're continuing, actually we're nearing the conclusion of a series of classes, Bible studies that we're doing on the book of 2 Corinthians, the second letter to the Corinthians found in the New Testament, written by the apostle Paul. My original intention was that this would be the last, lesson 15 would be the last, but in working on the lesson I was a little bit worried that it was going to take too long to cover this last section, and so I think it's better to do two shorter Bible studies than one great big long one. I don't think it's going to affect any of you greatly if we do it over two lessons and 2 Tuesdays rather than just one. So we're looking at the last section of the letter that Paul has written, and I really see this as an entire section, but we're going to break it down into two lessons over these last 2 weeks that we're together in this study. And today we're going to cover 2 Corinthians chapter 12, starting at verse 14, and we'll go into chapter 13, which is the last chapter, but we'll end at verse 4. So we'll get as far as verse 4 of chapter 13. So if you intend to stay with us, I would encourage you to find a Bible, a copy of the scriptures, go to the book of 2 Corinthians and find 2 Corinthians 12 and verse 14. The theme of this series of Bible studies, which is, I believe, the theme of the book of 2 Corinthians, is ministry of reconciliation in times of conflict. So that's the emphasis that we've been noticing together. There is some conflict and there's some need for reconciliation that's in the church of Corinth, and to which Paul has ministered and continues to minister through. He planted the church, he has visited, he's planning a third visit, as is going to be emphasized again, and so he's written them several letters, probably 4 altogether, but we have what we know as 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and we're in 2 Corinthians. Let's begin reading 2 Corinthians 12, and I'm going to begin at verse 14, verses 14 to 18. Here I am ready to come to you this third time, and I will not be a burden, because I do not want what is yours, but you. For children ought not to lay up for their parents, but parents for their children. I will most gladly spend and be spent for you. If I love you more, am I to be loved less? Let it be assumed that I did not burden you. Nevertheless, you say, since I was crafty, I took you in by deceit. Did I take advantage of you through any of those whom I sent to you? I urged Titus to go and sent the brother with him. Titus did not take advantage of you, did he? Did we not conduct ourselves with the same spirit? Did we not take the same steps? So here, starting at verse 14, Paul is emphasizing, as he has throughout this letter, the spirit in which he intends to come for this third visit to Corinth. And as we've read in this section, he loves them, and he's coming in a spirit of love. And he frames his love for them in these verses with the language of parents providing for their children, not the other way around. In other words, he's, I don't know, how sometimes children can take advantage of their parents and and go after them to get the things that they want. None of you who are children and have parents have ever done this, I'm sure. But anyways, apparently it does happen. And what really is supposed to happen, though, is that parents are to provide for their children. And parents are not to depend on their children to look after them. That's backwards, right? That's backwards. I mean, maybe in our old age, I've often told my youngest one, she just got married and is expecting her first child, but I've often told her, it's your job to look after me in my old age. But really, I'm kind of joking with her. The responsibility has been for me as the parent to care for her and our other children as well. That's the job of parents, to care for the children. And that's the framework that Paul sees his love for this church that he has planted and that he ministers to. They are like his children, and he's like a parent to them. So he doesn't want to become a burden to them. He's not coming to them to take advantage of them. And as he says in verse 15, I will most gladly spend and be spent for you. Doesn't that sound like what we often do for our children as we're raising them? We spend so much of our time and ourselves and our resources on raising those children. And that's the way it ought to be. And that's what Paul is doing for this church, because he loves them. If I love you more, am I to be loved less? So that's what he emphasizes. Are you willing to spend and be spent as Paul is in this situation in order to minister to those who are in conflict? Even a conflict between you and others. Are you willing to spend, in other words, to sacrifice and to be spent in order to not just so that someone wins and you lose? That's not the point. God isn't asking us to be victims of some kind of manipulation and abuse. But what he's asking us to do, and what Paul is demonstrating to us, is that in order to effectively communicate the love of God and show the way of reconciliation, it involves putting others ahead of ourselves. Paul talks about this in a lot of our letters, in a lot of his letters that we have to learn from. I think of Philippians, where he says, look not only to your own interests, but also to the interests of others. And so that's how we need to apply this example that we see in 2 Corinthians of ministering to other people to bring them to Christ, because that's the goal, and to strengthen them in their faith. If they are already our brothers and sisters in Christ, then our goal is not to make them like us. That's not the point. The point, though, is to build them up and to lift them up in Christ Jesus, and to help them have strong faith and to be well connected to God. And even if that means sometimes we have to sacrifice things, we have to give up our own comforts, put ourselves in sometimes situations that are uncomfortable. We have to stretch ourselves, in other words. And Paul, what an example of that. And of course, if you've been with us in our previous lesson, Paul has reminded us of all those things he's gone through: stonings and prison and shipwrecks and beatings and all the rest. But he doesn't regret any of them. Well, because first of all, it glorifies God, and he's lifting up God before others, but because it's resulting in good fruit among people that he's trying to share the gospel with. The Word of God is bearing fruit because of what Paul is investing, because of what he is spending and how he is being spent ministry-wise. He's not talking about money here. He's talking about his, although, I mean, sometimes literally it does mean spending money in order to help people, but it's about all the ways that you spend your time, your resources, your energy, your love, giving what you have to give in order to benefit others. So Paul has been an example of this. So in verse 16, he kind of says it ironically, I took you in by deceit. But I think what he's doing is he's putting a twist on what the accusation is. The accusation of his critics in Corinth is that Paul, he's a crafty guy. He's come in and he's deceived you. Don't listen to him, listen to us. These are the false apostles that we've seen addressed in this letter. And Paul, I think Paul kind of tongue in cheek is saying, oh yeah, like I've deceived you, have I? No, he's not. And in fact, then he holds up the integrity of Titus. Did I take advantage of you through any of those I sent to you? And then in verse 18, he talks about Titus. He points to the integrity that Titus has displayed in ministering to them, whom Paul has sent to them. And not just as proof, as an example of how they can trust Paul, but at least as an example of how they should trust Paul the way they trust Titus. If Titus is not proof that they can trust Paul, then at least look at how they trust Titus and say, come on now, if you have trusted him so much, you can trust me. So anyways, he raises Titus as either the proof or at least the example of to show that they can trust him. Okay, let's read some more, starting at verse 19, and again we're in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, and we're at verse 19, and I'm going to read to the end of the chapter, so it'll be 19 to 21. Have you been thinking all along that we have been defending ourselves before you? We are speaking in Christ before God. Everything we do, beloved, is for the sake of building you up. For I fear that when I come, I may find you not as I wish, and that you may find me not as you wish. I fear that there may perhaps be quarreling, jealousy, anger, selfishness, slander, gossip, conceit, and disorder. I fear that when I come again, my God may humble me before you, and that I may have to mourn over many who previously sinned and have not repented of the impurity, sexual immorality, and licentiousness that they have practiced. So the reminder in verse 11 is that everything is for the purpose of building them up. That's why he's coming to them. Okay? And there'll be more on that in the next lesson, which will be when we get to chapter 13 and verse 10. So I'm not going to stay on that very long right now, but I just want you to notice in verse 19 that he's emphasizing, that we're not defending ourselves, that this is all for the sake of building you up. That's why I've written you this letter. That's why I've done, as we've noticed, all this boasting that he's done, that he's talked about his weaknesses and the strength of God, the power of God that comes through his weaknesses, because that will be the key, and that is the way in which they will be built up, is by the power of God. And yeah, it's not really about Paul, he's trying to say. It's about you and Corinthians, about building you up. So then in verse 20, he lists all these behaviors, that he's afraid he's going to have to deal with, and that will go on when he gets there. And they're all contentious kinds of things, right? They're strife, quarreling, jealousy, anger, selfishness, slander, gossip, conceit, and disorder. This is the strife which the false apostles have stirred up amongst them and have stirred up against the apostle. And Paul is hoping that all of that will have been put to rest finally, and when he arrives, he doesn't have to deal with that. That's what he's hoping, but he'll deal with it if he has to, as we'll see, as we have seen, and as we'll see him say in the next chapter. He won't be lenient if he has to exercise his authority, but that's not what he wants to do. Okay, but he realizes that that's what he may find. And then in verse 21, there's another list, another set of behaviors. And this set of behaviors, let's just notice those, that I may have to mourn over many who previously sinned and have not repented. So they're continuing in their behavior of the impurity, sexual immorality, and licentiousness that they have practiced. So this set of behaviors which has plagued the church in Corinth, and which Paul addressed in 1 Corinthians, has to do with it's not so much to do with the bitterness and the jealousy and the disunity and that kind of thing. This has to do with some sexual immorality that's going on there in the congregation. There was the specific situation that they needed to address, with a couple of individuals, but there's the general struggle. They're in a culture where the standards of sexual morality are way different than in Christianity. There are some pagan religions, which some of them have come out of, where temple prostitution was just a part of it, and there's nothing of that nature in Christianity, and in fact, that kind of impropriety and immorality is against Christian principles, and the whole idea of sexual purity and faithfulness that is to be displayed by Christians in the way they conduct themselves. So he's hoping that he doesn't have to deal very much with that when he gets there either. Okay, that's the other thing he's concerned about in verse 21. He doesn't want this third visit to be disciplinary for either of these problems. He just wants it to be a time of mutual love and fellowship. He just wants to build them up and for them to encourage and build him up. That's what he's seeking. That's why he's going back to them. But he's not going to shy away if he has to address things. And he's not going to stay away. He's not going to just say, well, never mind, I'll just go on to other people who aren't struggling with stuff and who appreciate what I've done for them. No, he's not giving up on them. So chapter 13 then, let's read verses 1 and 2 first of all. We're going to split this up, and we're going to look at verses 1 through 4, but let's read verses 1 and 2 to begin with. This is the third time I am coming to you. Any charge must be sustained by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. In my translation, that's in quotation marks, and we'll see why in a moment. I warned those who sinned previously and all the others, and I warned them now, while absent, as I did when present on my second visit, that if I come again, I will not be lenient. Okay, so for all he has been saying, I want this third visit to be different, I want this third visit to be just congenial and warm and full of warm, fuzzy fellowship, he will address what needs to be addressed without being lenient. He'll exercise his authority if he needs to, and he won't be shy about that. But it will be done with due process, and what Paul quotes here, any charge must be sustained by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. I'm not going to just march in and pretend I know who's done what and who has said what and who's in the wrong and who's in the right and what all has come down. And if I have to deal with stuff like that, and if I have to exercise any discipline, well, first of all, if anybody has conflict, then we're going to deal with it this way. And he quotes from the law of Moses. It would be a principle established. If you were to look in Deuteronomy, it's there. I didn't hunt down the reference, and I probably should have. But any charge must be sustained by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. Now, it's not that they're under the law of Moses, but that's a principle that is very strong, and by the way, was precisely endorsed by Jesus himself. So it's a principle not just tied to and that dies with the law of Moses, but it's a principle intended to be carried into the church and into Christianity. Jesus said this in Matthew chapter 18, verses 15 and 16. If any member of the church sins against you, go and point out the fault when 2 of you are alone. If the member listens to you, you have regained that one. But if you are not listened to, take 1 or 2 others along with you, so that every word may be confirmed by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. So you see that principle is there. The ideal thing is that Jesus emphasizes, and I'm sure Paul would as well, is if instead of having to involve other people and bring it before the church or anything like that, the important thing to do within the church between brothers or sisters or brother and sister who have some kind of conflict is for them to get together one-on-one and work it out and solve it. Now, if that doesn't work, well then, if you're trying to get something fixed between you and another person, then bring along 2 and maybe 3 witnesses to sit down and say, okay, I want to sort this out with you. I want them to hear the story. They need to hear your side of the story. They need to hear my side of the story. And in the presence of 2 or 3 witnesses, I want to bring this up. And then if that doesn't work, then it may need to be brought up before the whole church. Jesus goes on to talk about that. It may need to be a disciplinary thing that the whole church exercises. And of course, that's what Paul ended up having to instruct the Corinthians to do in 1 Corinthians with a certain situation. So anyways, Paul is just kind of declaring before he comes, look, I'm going, when I come, if I have to deal with anything, it's going to be on this principle. It's going to be with fairness and with due process. It's going to be on this principle that, comes from the law of Moses that God established with them back then, and which, by the way, Jesus endorsed. So that's the basis on which he comes. So now then, verses 3 to 4, he continues, since you desire proof that Christ is speaking in me, he is not weak in dealing with you, but is powerful in you. For he was crucified in weakness, but lives by the power of God. For we are weak in him, but in dealing with you, we will live with him by the power of God. Now, this is a very, really powerful statement that Paul is making, and it really draws upon what he's been doing throughout the letter. You know, Paul's been emphasizing how the strength of God, the power of God, is demonstrated through weakness, through human weakness, through his weakness, Paul's weakness. He says, when I am weak, then he is strong, you know, or when I am weak, then I am strong, because the power of God shines through. And Jesus demonstrated that at the cross. Here's the Son of God, the most powerful being on the planet at that time, and surrendering himself in what looked like total weakness. You know, an unfair trial, beatings, mockery, and finally crucifixion. And it looked like, well, what's he doing? Why is he being so weak and helpless? Well, he actually wasn't being weak and helpless. He was showing the strength of God to be the sacrifice, and to be the redeemer, and to be the conqueror over sin and death, which he completed, of course, when he rose from the grave on the third day after he was crucified. And so Christ himself is the example of what Paul has been trying to emphasize, you know, that God's power is made evidence through weakness, you know. So, you know, and so Paul has talked about all his sufferings and weaknesses throughout this letter. But what he's really been saying is that God's power is in my life. Can you not see that by all the things that have happened? And when I come to you, I'm coming to you with God's power. With God's power. And they ought to recognize that. He has emphasized his personal weaknesses in order to show the strength of Christ in his words and his actions. And this sacrifice of self in its own way follows Christ's example. So we need to think about that as well. We all want to be strong. We all want to be strong in our faith. We all want to be strong in our character. We want to be strong in our relationships and in our service and in our connection with other people. We want to show strength. But we need to understand that strength, spiritual strength, does not look like human domination. That's not what it is. It's not perfection. It's not a lack of surrender, but it is, in fact, a giving of self and a setting aside of some things in order for the power of God to be on display and for real strength to show. Yeah, for real strength to show. Anyways, we could spend a lot of time talking about that. I don't want to take too much time with that. But that brings us to verse 4 of chapter 13. Next lesson, we're going to start at verse 5 from 2 Corinthians 13, and we'll complete the letter, and that will be our last lesson. So I didn't want to rush today's lesson, and I want you to take your time, and if you have time, spend more time reading this. Read some of the other verses that we've referred to, that we've connected this to, and think about how it applies, because it so applies. It applies to our churches that we're a part of, how we're to behave together the purity with which of our conduct amongst ourselves, but also just the spirit in which we are to minister to each other. And especially if we're resolving conflict. I can't think of, well, because there's no such thing as a church where there is no conflict. Everywhere I've lived, and I've loved and benefited greatly from the places where I've been in my life, where I was raised in the Christian faith with my parents, in my home, my sister. We were part of some marvelous churches. And through my teen years and into adulthood, and as I prepared for and then became engaged as I continue to be in full-time ministry, moved around several places, worked with a lot of different churches. But it doesn't matter where you go. The church is the people, and because of that, there's going to be some conflicts arise. We're not perfect, and some strife, and the real blessing in Christianity is that Christ has set the stage and the example for us, largely through the cross. But even you go through his whole ministry and how he deals with everybody, even how he deals with his critics, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, but how he deals with tax collectors and sinners, and how he deals with the poor, how he deals with the crowds, how he deals one-on-one with individuals. All of this gives an example to us as Christians for the way we ought to conduct ourselves, both within the church and also with others outside. There's so much, and it's life at times, and maybe it's not just at times, maybe it'll be the whole time, will seem like going from one conflict to another, which makes you think, wow, that doesn't sound like much fun. But really, the beauty of conflict is that when you resolve it the way Paul resolves it, the way Christ resolves it, when you give of yourself unselfishly in love and heal a broken relationship, something beautiful happens. And that's what God has done with us through Jesus Christ. And that's what we're invited, challenged, privileged to do with one another and with others around us. It really makes for a beautiful life. The ministry of reconciliation in times of conflict. Do we live in tough times? Yep. We've got a convoy of protesters in the capital city of Canada at the moment as I speak. And a lot of people are up in arms about them being there. And a lot of people who are in support of them being there are up in arms about various things and are attaching their loyalties to that cause, which is, I'm not making a statement about what side of that a Christian should or should not be on. That's not the point. The point is that there are sides that are being taken even amongst brothers and sisters in the faith. Conflict. It's the mark of our times, I think. The worst thing about this pandemic, not to minimize, the loss of life and the suffering of the disease, not to minimize that, but really the worst thing about the COVID-19 pandemic, in my opinion, has been the conflict that has been created between people who think this is true and that is true, who think this should be government policy and that should be. I don't want to get bogged down on, and I'm not going to take a side, What I'm saying is, never has the time, well, I shouldn't say never has the time been more important, but can you see how important this time is for Christians to behave the way Paul is challenging the Corinthians to behave? Let's mend our ways, and let's resolve conflict and give of ourselves in ministry now more than ever. Now more than ever. Join us for the final lesson next time from 2 Corinthians, and we'll start another series after that. Thank you for joining us tonight, and remember, God's grace is for you in 2022.